This is James. The image that no one forgets is of him, a man of faith with his shoulders slumped not from the weight of work, but from the humiliation of having to lower himself for a plate of food for his children. He was forced to sweep the filthy floor of a warehouse in exchange for scraps, in front of the whole town, but the owner of the world was already preparing a feast. Has your faith ever been tested to the point where you felt your dignity was being torn from you, piece by piece? Before I tell you how God acted in his life right in the middle of that humiliation, when all seemed lost, comment here where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place our shame in his hands. James's conflict didn't start in that warehouse. It began weeks earlier, in the silence of his modest home. The cupboards, once filled by the provision of his work and the care of his late wife, Rebecca, now echoed with emptiness. Every open door was a painful reminder of his failure. His 3 children, Lucas, David, and little Leah, did not yet understand the depth of the crisis, but they felt the hunger. Their gaze, a mixture of trust and need, was like a knife that tore at James's soul every moment. He felt like a failure as a father, as a provider, and the weight of that responsibility was a silent storm that threatened to drown the faith he had left. He prayed, he fasted, but the answer seemed more distant with every rumbling stomach. James's pain was twofold. There was the recent sharp pain of widowhood, the absence of Rebecca in every corner of the house, in every difficult decision he now had to make alone. And there was the pain of impotence, born from losing his job at the only factory in the region, which closed its doors and took with it the security of so many families. In the small country town, where opportunities were as rare as rain in the desert, James was just one more. Known for his integrity and his calm demeanor, some neighbors now looked at him with pity, while others, more cynical, mistook his serenity for a lack of initiative. Little did they know that inside, James was fighting the greatest battle of his life, a struggle not to let despair extinguish the flame of his faith in God. After knocking on every door he knew, asking for help from distant relatives who also couldn't help, and exhausting the small reserve his wife had left, James found himself facing the last resort, the one his pride and dignity tried to avoid at all costs. Mr. Valdemar's warehouse. The walk to the town center had never seemed so long. Each step was heavy. Each glance from an acquaintance on the street felt like a judgment. He was not going to beg for alms. The idea disgusted him. He was going to ask for an advance, a chance promising to pay with the sweat of his brow, with any manual labor that came up. He just needed a little rice, beans, and flour, enough to silence his children's hunger for a few more days. As he pushed open the wooden door of the warehouse, the shrill bell seemed to announce his arrival to the entire town. The place was full. Housewives doing their shopping, workers grabbing something for lunch. All eyes turned to him, and James felt the heat of shame rise to his face. Behind the counter, Mr. Valdemar, a man whose avarice was as well known as his name, stared at him over his glasses with an air of superiority. The atmosphere, which smelled of grains and spices, suddenly felt heavy, thin. James felt exposed, his need stamped on his face for all to see. He approached the counter slowly, like a defendant approaching his judge, rehearsing the words he would use to not sound like a beggar. In a low voice, almost a whisper, trying to keep the conversation private, James explained his situation. He didn't speak of his children's hunger. He didn't want to use the children as a shield. He spoke of his willingness to work, of his need for a small credit, for food, and assured that he would honor the debt as soon as he got any job. He clung to his reputation as an honest man, the only thing he had left. For a moment, an awkward silence hung in the air. The other customers pretended to look at the shelves, but their ears were attentive, catching every word of that private drama unfolding in public. Valdemar's response, however, would not come in a whisper. It would come like thunder for all to hear. Valdemar let out a dry, mocking laugh that echoed through the store. "Credit for you, James," he said aloud, savoring every word and the attention he was getting. "A man who got fired and can't find another job wants credit? The whole town knows about your situation." The humiliation was instantaneous and brutal. James felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. His face burned, his hands sweated cold. He wanted to disappear, to run from there, but the image of his hungry children kept him rooted to the spot. He just lowered his head, unable to face the looks of pity and morbid curiosity that were now fixed on him without any disguise. He was being turned into a spectacle, the attraction of the day at the warehouse. Not satisfied, Valdemar continued his show of cruelty. He leaned over the counter, a wicked smile on his lips. "But today I'm feeling generous," he said, his tone laden with sarcasm. "Let's do this. My storeroom in the back is a pigsty, full of dust and rat droppings. If you take a broom and sweep it all, make it shine, maybe I'll consider giving you a bag of cornmeal and some beef bones for your soup. Take it or leave it." The proposal was not a work agreement. It was a sentence of degradation. He was not offering a fair trade. He was testing the limits of that man, wanting to see how far need could bend the spine of someone everyone knew to be a man of faith and principles. The silence in the store became heavy, almost palpable. All eyes were on James, waiting for his reaction. They expected a cry of anger, a sharp retort, or for him to simply turn his back and walk away, defeated. Mrs. Iris, a lady from his church who was at the back of the store, brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears of compassion and helplessness. She knew James's character, she knew his pain, but to everyone's surprise, James did not explode. He stood motionless for a long second that seemed like an eternity. The world around him disappeared. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and in his heart a silent prayer was made. "Father, I don't understand, but help me get through this. May it be for your honor." With a dignity that defied the humiliating situation, James lifted his head. His gaze was not of anger or shame, but of a strange and profound peace. He looked at Valdemar, not at the man but through him, and nodded his head slowly. "I accept," he said, his voice firm, though quiet. His response silenced the room in a way a shout never could. There was more strength in his submission than in any act of rebellion. He walked around the counter, picked up the old grimy broom that Valdemar pointed to, and without looking at anyone else, walked toward the dark door of the storeroom. He was not just going to sweep a dirty floor. He was laying his pride on God's altar, turning an act of shame into a silent sacrifice. The storeroom door closed behind James, and the darkness swallowed him for a moment. The smell of mold, accumulated dust, and a sour odor of dampness invaded his nostrils. A single weak bulb, hanging from a bare wire, cast a sad yellowish light on piles of old sacks, broken crates, and a filth that seemed to have accumulated for years. It was a forgotten place, a reflection of how he felt inside. The first sweep raised a cloud of dust that made him cough. Each movement of his arm felt heavy, not from physical effort, but from the weight of the situation. He wasn't just cleaning Valdemar's dirt. He felt as if he were sweeping away the remnants of his own dignity, exposing his misery to himself in that oppressive solitude. As the broom dragged the filth across the rough cement floor, James's mind wandered. He remembered an afternoon, years earlier, when he and Rebecca had cleaned the small house they had just rented together. They laughed, splashed water on each other, dreamed of the children who would fill those rooms. Rebecca, with her luminous smile, once said, "Love, it doesn't matter how simple our house is. If we take care of it with love, it becomes a palace." Now in that foul-smelling storeroom, her memory was both a comfort and a torture. He was cleaning another man's palace, a man who despised him, in exchange for scraps to feed the children he and Rebecca had so dreamed of protecting and caring for. A silent, hot tear ran down his face and mixed with the sweat and dust. The sound of the broom was the only sound, a monotonous rhythm that marked the time of his humiliation. Outside, in the store, life went on. He could hear the jingle of the bell, the voices of customers, Valdemar's laughter. Every sound was a reminder that he was there, hidden, debased, while the world went on, indifferent to his ordeal. He felt like a leper from biblical times, isolated from the community, marked by his condition. The temptation to drop everything, to kick the crates and storm out screaming against the injustice, was immense. It was the voice of the flesh, of wounded pride, whispering in his ear, telling him he didn't deserve this, that God had abandoned him in that dark, stinking hole. Suddenly the storeroom door creaked open, and Valdemar's figure appeared on the threshold, blocking the little light coming from the store. He crossed his arms, the same scornful smile on his face. "So, James, is the job too hard for a strong man like you?" he mocked. "Don't forget the corners. That's where the rats like to party. Clean it properly, or your payment will be less than we agreed." The cruelty was Unnecessary, a deliberate act to twist the knife already embedded in his chest even further. James did not answer. He just paused for a moment, gripped the broom handle tighter, and returned to his work, sweeping more diligently, as if trying to sweep away the merchant's venomous voice as well. When Valdemar left, leaving him in the dim light again, James's mind turned to his children. He imagined Lucas, the eldest, trying to distract his siblings so they wouldn't think about their hunger. He imagined little David asking for the 1,000th time what time his father would be back, and he imagined little Leah, with her big eyes, waiting at the door. This image gave him a strength he didn't know he still possessed. This humiliation was not about him. It was about them. It was about the love of a father who was willing to go to the bottom of the pit to ensure his children had bread to eat. Pride was a luxury he could not afford. His mission was greater than his pain. It was at that moment, of deep anguish, with his body tired and his soul wounded, that a passage from the Bible came to his mind, clear as water. It wasn't a forced memory. It simply appeared, like a breath of life. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Peter's words echoed in his heart, not as a command, but as a promise. He was not humbling himself before Valdemar. He was humbling himself under the hand of God. That storeroom was not the end. It was part of the process. That due time of exaltation might not be today nor tomorrow, but it would come. The faith, which had previously seemed like a flickering flame, began to burn with a new intensity. Something changed inside James. The rhythm of his sweeping altered. It was no longer the shuffling movement of a defeated man. There was a purpose in every gesture. He was no longer cleaning the floor to please Valdemar or to earn a bag of cornmeal. He was serving God in that unlikely place. He was turning that act of degradation into an act of worship. He began to sweep the corners not because Valdemar ordered it, but because he was now doing his best for the Lord. The dust that rose was no longer a sign of filth, but of transformation. He was clearing the ground so that God could plant something new. The peace he had felt when making the decision in the store returned, but now stronger, more solid, a peace that surpassed all understanding. Outside, Mrs. Iris, who hadn't had the heart to leave, remained in a corner of the store watching the storeroom door. She couldn't see what was happening inside, but she prayed in silence. She asked God to give James strength, to guard the good man's heart from bitterness and resentment. She represented the church that weeps with, that intercedes, that even without being able to do anything practical, stands in the gap in prayer. Her presence there, though silent, was a bond of faith, a spiritual vigil that connected James's suffering to the hope of the community. She didn't know it, but her prayer was joining James's, creating an atmosphere of spiritual expectation in that hostile environment. As James continued his task, nearing the end, a different noise caught everyone's attention in the store. It wasn't the sound of a common town car, but the smooth, powerful engine of a luxury vehicle. Through the dusty front window of the warehouse, the customers saw a sleek black car of a model they had never seen around there, park right in front. The car completely clashed with the simple, dusty landscape of the main street. The jingle of the doorbell rang once more, but the person who entered was not a local resident. It was a tall, well-dressed man in a suit and tie, with an air of authority and seriousness that imposed an immediate silence on the store. The stranger looked around, his gaze sweeping the rustic environment until it landed on Valdemar, who immediately straightened his posture, forcing a servile smile on his face, sniffing out the possibility of a good deal. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" said the merchant in a syrupy voice that James, even from the storeroom, could hear. The man in the suit, however, did not seem interested in shopping. His expression was that of someone looking for something, or rather someone specific. "Good morning," he said, in a calm and firm voice. "I am looking for a man named James. He was Rebecca's husband. I was told I might find him here." The name James, spoken with respect by that important man, dropped like a bomb in the middle of the warehouse. The mention of James's name coming from the mouth of that imposing man completely changed the dynamic of the place. The looks of pity and contempt that were previously directed at James now transformed into pure curiosity and confusion. Who was this man? And what connection could he have with the poor and humiliated James? Mr. Valdemar was visibly surprised. His mind, quick to calculate and to malice, tried to process the information. Perhaps this man was a collector, someone to whom James owed money. This possibility pleased him. With an air of being in control of the situation, he pointed with his thumb towards the storeroom. "Ah, James. Yes, I know him," he said with false generosity. "He's back there doing a little job for me, paying off a small bill he had here." Valdemar's answer, said with the intention of appearing magnanimous while belittling James, had the opposite effect. The man in the suit, whose name was still a mystery, frowned. A shadow of displeasure crossed his face. "A job? Paying off a bill?" he repeated, his voice now tinged with disbelief. He didn't wait for further explanation. With firm, decisive steps, he walked around the counter and headed directly for the storeroom door, completely ignoring Valdemar, who stood frozen with a faint yellow smile on his face. The other customers held their breath. The play that Valdemar had staged was about to take a turn that no one, least of all him, could have predicted. The businessman opened the storeroom door, and the scene he saw left him shocked. There was James, the man his late friend Rebecca spoke of with such admiration, covered in dust, sweat dripping from his forehead, holding an old broom in the middle of all that filth. The contrast between the dignity he expected to find and the degrading situation James was in was stark. For a moment, the man was speechless. James, seeing the elegant figure standing in the doorway, also stopped, confused. He didn't recognize the visitor. Their eyes met for an instant. James's tired and tested gaze crossed with the stranger's shocked and questioning one. The light streaming through the open door seemed like a spotlight, illuminating the stage of that surreal scene. "James?" the man asked, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "My name is Afonso Medeiros. I don't know if you remember me, but your wife, Rebecca, she was an angel in my life." James continued to stare at him, trying to search his memory for that face. Afonso continued, "Years ago my company went through a terrible crisis, and I lost almost everything. Rebecca was a volunteer in a social project that distributed food baskets, and she was the one who gave me food when my family and I had nothing. She didn't just give me food, she gave me hope. She prayed with me." The revelation hung in the air, dense and powerful. The seed of kindness that Rebecca had planted in the past was there, germinating at the most unlikely moment. "I promised myself that if God lifted me up again, I would never forget that gesture," Afonso continued, his eyes welling up. "My company recovered, and today we are expanding. I found out too late about Rebecca's passing and felt immense pain. I came here to offer my condolences and to look for you. Rebecca always talked about your character, your honesty, your competence as a foreman at the factory. She said you were the most upright man she knew." Every word from Afonso was like a balm on James's wounded soul. He was no longer hearing about his failure, his need, his humiliation. He was hearing about his honor, his worth, through the memory of his beloved wife. And then came the final blow to the humiliation, the turnaround that only God could orchestrate. "James, I am opening a new logistics branch in the neighboring city, and I came here today to offer you the position of operations manager. The position is yours if you'll accept it. Rebecca told me so much about your capability that I didn't think of anyone else for this role. I didn't come to offer a handout. I came to offer a partnership, an opportunity for the man of value your wife so admired." The proposal was so extraordinary, so out of place in that dirty storeroom, that James felt his legs weaken. The world seemed to spin. The offer wasn't just a job, it was the restoration of his honor, the answer to his prayers, God's timing being fulfilled right before his eyes. The broom, that symbol of his humiliation, the scepter of his debasement, slipped from his hands. The sound of the wooden handle hitting the cement floor echoed in the silence of the storeroom. It was a definitive sound, the sound of a cycle breaking, of a burden being released. James looked at his empty hands, then at Afonso, and the tears he had held back so forcefully finally came. They were no longer tears of pain or shame, but of overwhelming relief, of a gratitude so deep it couldn't be put into words. He tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. Afonso approached and placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and respect. The honor of a man of God is not measured by what he has in his hands, but by what he has in his heart, Afonso said, his voice thick with emotion. At the storeroom door, witnessing the whole scene, was Mr. Valdemar. His face, once flushed with arrogance, was now pale, ashen as wax. The scornful smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of shock and dread. He heard every word. He saw the offer. He understood too late the magnitude of his mistake. The man he had treated like trash, whom he had publicly humiliated for a plate of food, was being exalted in a way he could never have imagined. He had not just humiliated a father in need, he had mocked a man who was under the direct care of God. And the divine reckoning came not with lightning and thunder, but with the silent arrival of that elegant car and that irrefutable job offer. James, still trembling, finally found his voice. "Sir," he began, looking at Afonso, I don't know what to say. I accept. With all my soul, I accept." At that moment he was no longer the unemployed man, the pitiful widower, the man who swept the floor for scraps. He was the new logistics manager for the Medeiros company. He walked out of the storeroom, passing Valdemar as if he were a ghost. There was no hatred or triumph in his eyes, only the peace of one who had just witnessed a miracle. He left behind the dust, the filth, and the humiliation. He left behind the man who had debased him and walked toward the future God had prepared for him, a banquet served in the middle of the desert of his greatest trial. The customers in the store watched everything in reverent silence. What they had witnessed was not just a turn of fortune, it was a living testimony. It was like seeing a page of the Bible come to life right there, in the middle of the dusty warehouse. They saw a man enter, bowed by shame, and leave with his head held high, his honor restored not by human hands, but by a providence that could only be divine. The murmur that followed was no longer of gossip, but of astonishment and awe. Mrs. Iris in the corner was crying openly, but now her tears were of joy and gratitude. She had prayed for strength, and God had answered with exaltation. That day would be forever marked in the memory of the small town. Afonso accompanied James out of the store, leaving behind a petrified Valdemar and a stunned audience. The fresh air of the street had never felt so pure to James. The sun, which before had seemed to mock his misery, now warmed his face like a welcoming embrace. "Let's go, James," Afonso said gently. "First, let's go to a restaurant. You and I have a lot to talk about, and then we'll do some real shopping to fill your pantry. Your children will no longer go hungry." The mention of his children made James's heart overflow. The image of the cornmeal and bones was replaced by the vision of a full shopping cart, a bountiful table, the smiles on the faces of Lucas, David, and Leah. The provision was no longer a crumb, it was an abundance. The news spread through the town faster than wildfire. Before James even got home, the story of his humiliation and his sudden exaltation was already the only topic of conversation. The same people who had looked at him with pity or indifference now spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and awe. The story was not about a man who got lucky, it was about a man whose faith was publicly tested and publicly honored. James unintentionally became a local legend, a living example that God's justice may seem slow to human eyes, but it never fails. His calm and dignity in the face of Valdemar's insult took on a new meaning. It was not passivity, it was the strength of one who knows in whom he trusts. Meanwhile, in the warehouse, the atmosphere became unbearable for Valdemar. The remaining customers looked at him with veiled contempt. No one wanted to be served by him anymore. One by one, people left their groceries on the counter and walked out in silence. The money he loved so much seemed dirty, stained by his cruelty. Mrs. Iris was the last to leave. Before passing through the door, she turned and looked Valdemar in the eyes. She didn't say a word, but her gaze, which had been one of compassion for James, was now one of deep sadness for him. That look condemned him more than any accusation. Valdemar was left alone in his store, surrounded by his merchandise but immersed in a poverty of spirit that no amount of money could cure. James's arrival home was the most beautiful scene of that day. He did not enter empty-handed, but with bags and bags of food brought by an employee Afonso had assigned to help him. His children's eyes widened. Lucas, the eldest, looked at his father and at the abundance, and, with the wisdom of children, understood that something miraculous had happened. "Dad, are we going to have a feast?" asked little David. James knelt, hugged the three of them tightly, and with a choked voice replied, "Yes, my son. Today, and every day. The Father in heaven has prepared a feast for us. That night, the prayer before dinner was different. It was not a request. It was a thanksgiving that sprang from the depths of a restored soul. In the following weeks, James's life was completely transformed. With Afonso's help, he got a better house in the neighboring town near his new job. He excelled as a manager, applying the same integrity and dedication he had always had in everything he did. His children flourished in the new environment, safe and well cared for. James did not become an arrogant man with his new position. On the contrary, the experience made him even more humble and grateful. He never forgot the storeroom, the dust, the smell of mold. That memory was no longer a wound, but an anchor, a constant reminder of where God had brought him from and of the faithfulness of the one who hears the cry of his people. For Mr. Valdemar, life took the opposite course. His attitude that day stained his reputation indelibly. People began to avoid his warehouse, preferring to walk further to shop elsewhere. His clientele dwindled to the point that the once prosperous business began to lose money. He became a bitter and lonely man, haunted by the memory of the day he humiliated the man God chose to honor. His punishment was not a sudden bankruptcy, but a slow and gradual decline, proof that sowing is optional, but reaping is mandatory. He learned the hard way that there is a type of debt that cannot be paid with money. James's faith community was deeply impacted. His testimony spread through the churches in the region. Pastors used him as an example in their sermons on faith, perseverance, and the sovereignty of God. James's story strengthened the faith of many who were going through their own trials, giving them hope that even in the darkest valley, God is working in silence. Mrs. Iris, whenever she recounted what she had witnessed, would get emotional. "I saw it with my own eyes," she would say. "I saw a man surrender himself into God's hands at the bottom of the pit, and I saw God extend his hand and place him in a position of honor. Never doubt what our God can do." James's life continued to prosper, but the greatest wealth he gained was not the position or the salary. It was the legacy of faith he was building for his children. They grew up hearing the story of how God turned their father's greatest humiliation into his greatest blessing. They learned that character is worth more than gold, and that true strength is not in retaliating, but in trusting. James remarried years later to a woman of faith who loved his children as if they were her own. His house once again became a complete home, full of love, laughter, and above all the presence of God. The banquet that began with a grocery shopping trip became a banquet of life. Mr. Valdemar's warehouse eventually closed down. The building stood abandoned for a time, a silent monument to arrogance and its fall. It is said that years later, a new church bought the property and renovated it, transforming the space, including the old storeroom, into a hall for Bible studies and prayer. The place that was the stage for James's deepest humiliation became a place of worship, where many other people would find strength and hope. A powerful symbol of how God specializes in redeeming stories and turning places of shame into places of glory. That day, the small town learned that God can prepare a table in the wilderness, and that the greatest honor is not bestowed by men in their shops, but by heaven, which exalts those who choose faith in the valley of humiliation. James's story is not just about a financial turnaround. It is about the nature of a God who sees, who hears, who cares, and who, in due time, acts in ways that confound the wise and shame the powerful of this world. It is a reminder that even when we are forced to sweep the floor, if our heart is in the right place, we are just preparing the ground for the miracle He has already prepared. If you know someone who is going through a trial and needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. James's story is proof that no humiliation is the end when you have a God who writes the final chapter. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, about how faith in God can move mountains and turn weeping into joy. Thank you for listening and staying until the end. May the peace of the Lord be with you.